Well, and the yeah. Oh, it's got to be. Well, we certainly need to pray for our country and yeah.
Well, on a lot of things, when it says sex, they don't have my answer. I don't say yes. Good answer.
All right. Well, any other prayer requests this morning? Oh, it was good. Yeah, we had Trevor. Well, you weren't there. Never mind. I'm sorry. I want to say we had 8 adults and 4 kids. Dalen and Lucas came, and about 6 kids if you count, because Dalen and Lucas and Elisha and Gabe and Bryson and Gaines, the Walker's little boy. Speaking of, I was just saying your son was at the parade yesterday, so yeah. So yeah, all the kids and the adults, we all crammed on a float and went down through there, and the kids are yelling, "Come to Bible school! Come to Bible school!" So, okay. Well, here's another one. Yeah, but it looks like Chris and Larry's MIA today. So, yeah, so it went good. The crowd, I felt like, wasn't quite as much as it has been in previous years, but I was sitting right next to Gabe on the float, and he was yelling, "Come to Bible school!" And every now and then somebody would be out there and say, "Okay, we'll try to come," and he'd get all excited about that. But yeah, and people were like taking pictures and videos of the float, so hopefully they'll see Rock Heritage and be reminded of the date and everything. So. I think it went well. Yeah. Well, if that's all our prayer requests, Denny, can I get you to open us up in prayer this morning? All right. Well, so you've all got that nice, fancy new book. We're not going to be using that this morning. So I want to do kind of an intro this morning. How many of you has really studied Nehemiah before? A couple of you? It's kind of an obscure book, right? So we don't study it that often, but it's definitely an interesting one. So we'll talk about kind of the background of it a little bit today, and hopefully get you excited to learn more. For a text today in our Bibles, I'd like for us to go to the end of 2 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles chapter 36. And we'll read about half of this chapter here. And you say, well, there's a book in between 2 Chronicles and Nehemiah, and there is. And we'll talk about that here. But looking at 2 Chronicles chapter 36, I think will get us to the place where we're at in Nehemiah. Okay, so I'm going to just, not because the first part of the chapter is not important, but just for time's sake, start in verse 11 here. It says, Zedekiah was 21 years old when he began to reign, and reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord his God, and humbled not himself before Jeremiah the prophet, speaking from the mouth of the Lord. And he also rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar, who had made him swear by God. But he stiffened his neck and hardened his heart from turning unto the Lord God of Israel. Moreover, all the chief of the priests and the people transgressed very much after all the abominations of the heathen, and polluted the house of the Lord which he had hallowed in Jerusalem. And the Lord God of their fathers sent to them by his messengers, rising up betimes and sending, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they mocked the messengers of God, and despised his words, and misused his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord arose against his people, till there was no remedy. That sounds promising, right? Sounds like a good thing. So getting us to where we're at in Nehemiah, verse 17 here says, Therefore he brought upon them the king of the Chaldees, who slew their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion upon young man or maiden, old man, or him that stooped for age. He gave them all into his hand. And all the vessels of the house of God, great and small, and the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king and of his princes, all these he brought to Babylon. And they burnt the house of God, and brake down the wall of Jerusalem, and burnt all the palaces thereof with fire, and destroyed all the goodly vessels thereof. And them that had escaped from the sword carried he away to Babylon, where they were servants to him and his sons until the reign of the kingdom of Persia, till fulfilled the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed their Sabbaths. For as long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath, to fulfill 70 years. So, got us a little bit of a downer lesson today, right? A bunch of bad stuff happening to the Jewish people here. So starting off here, well, let's back up, right? Y'all remember that missionary came, was that last week or the week before? 2 weeks ago? 2 weeks ago. The guy with the spices? Webb was his last name, right? So he preached out of 2 Chronicles, I believe it was, about Hezekiah. Remember that? And he preached about how Hezekiah showed Babylon all his stuff, and then Jeremiah comes to him and says, hey, you shouldn't have done that. Everything you've got's going to go to Babylon. Here it's coming to fruition, right? Here we see in what verse was that? Verse 21, it says, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah. So that's what this is referencing, right? It's referencing when Jeremiah told Hezekiah that everything's going to be taken to Babylon. And so we see here, this Zedekiah here was kind of the ruler in Jerusalem there, and we see not a whole lot of good stuff from him, right? It says just outright that he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. He didn't listen to Jeremiah. He rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, who they had like a sort of agreement with. Of course, Nebuchadnezzar being in Babylon, right? And they mocked and ridiculed and ignored the prophets and messengers and priests and God in general, right? And so didn't sit well, right? Of course, with God, and so he's going to, in a sense, punish these people. Of course, he had ordained this before time, right? He had told Jeremiah that this was going to happen many years before, but it's coming to pass here, and this is Jeremiah is the one that made the prophecy to Hezekiah. Yeah. And so he's using Babylon to punish the Jews here for their disobedience, right? And not just the disobedience of Zedekiah here, but he was the most recent, right? So the one that we're reading about here, and he kind of summarizes what's wrong with the Jewish people at this point. And so the Babylonians, they come in and they take over Jerusalem, and it says that they killed many of the Jews. They destroyed the temple, they destroyed the city, they destroyed the walls, and then we're done with 2nd Chronicles, right? It says they took many of the people that they didn't kill, they took them away to Babylon, and it says there they stayed for 70 years. 70 years, 70 years. All right, so that's where we leave in 2nd Chronicles. Now, I didn't read the last two verses on purpose because the last two verses of 2nd Chronicles are almost word for word the first 2 or 3 verses from Ezra, the next book. So we pick up there. All right. Now you say, well, I thought we were studying Nehemiah. Where are we going with this, right? All right, let's get into. We'll get there. We got to have some background, right? We got to know where we're going, know where we came from to get there. So hopefully that 2nd Chronicles, the last chapter of it there, kind of orients you to time and place. So has anybody studied Ezra very much? No? Okay. We might should have started there in hindsight, right? Because Ezra is kind of considered the first of the 2 books here, Ezra and Nehemiah. So basically in Ezra, we pick up at the end of 2nd Chronicles here, and we have this guy, Zerubbabel. You might recognize that name. He led the Jewish people back to Jerusalem to reestablish the city and to begin rebuilding the temple. Then Ezra comes along, finishes rebuilding the temple, and reorients the people to God. And then we've got Nehemiah, who we're going to be studying. So the book of Ezra here, the next book after 2nd Chronicles, of course, took place around 538 BC to around 458 BC. Now, that's not backwards. Remember how BC works. You're counting down instead of counting up. So 538 to 458 BC. Nehemiah follows that directly from about 444 to 430 BC. So there were 3 returns of the people, the Jewish people, to Jerusalem following their exile in Babylon. The first was Zerubbabel. The second is Ezra. The third is Nehemiah. Okay? And so we're going to be studying the third, and if we like it, we may do like a prequel thing and go back and study Ezra, right? We'll take the Star Wars approach. So let's look at the book of Nehemiah here. We're not studying 2nd Chronicles right now. We're not studying Ezra right now. We're studying Nehemiah. So what do we need to know about Nehemiah? Well, most people believe that Nehemiah was, of course, written by Nehemiah. There are some groups that say, no, it was written by somebody else. Some people believe that Ezra and Nehemiah used to be one book combined because they do follow a similar topic, right? And then there's another group of people that say they were combined, and then we separated them, and then we combined them again, and now we've separated them again. There's yet another group that says they were separate, we combined them, and now we've separated them back out. So, I'm just going to treat it like it is and say Nehemiah is its own book. but it does go hand in hand with Ezra. So we may reference Ezra a few times throughout our study. But so we believe it to be written by Nehemiah. It's, of course, centered around this character, Nehemiah. So who was he? He was a Jew that had been taken to Babylon, right, with everybody else, or raised in Babylon at least. And so he has developed a position serving in the Persian Empire here under this king. And you're going to have to forgive my pronunciation of him. We'll hopefully get it over time. But I'm going with Artaxerxes, okay? King Artaxerxes. He is the king of Persia at this time. And so Nehemiah is serving as a cupbearer to him in the Persian Empire. Not much is known about Nehemiah's history up until this point. We will learn early on in our study that he has a brother, Hananiah. We see in the first chapter, Hananiah brings him news of the continued desolation of Jerusalem, specifically the lack of Jerusalem having walls. So Ezra, like we said, the book of Ezra kind of chronicles the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the temple. So in contrast to that, we see Nehemiah here is chosen by God to lead the people in further rebuilding the city, specifically the walls. So I like comparing and contrasting. I realize that we're not super familiar with either one of these books, right? But I think we can grasp the main points fairly easily. Ezra focuses on rebuilding and renewing the city, right? But in a larger context, it focuses on rebuilding and renewing a relationship with God, right? The Israelites, they had gotten away from God. That's why they had gotten taken over to Babylon. That's why the city had been destroyed. And so Ezra's focusing on rebuilding and renewing that relationship with God. Nehemiah here, as the title of our study, Be Determined, says, he's focusing on living for, standing up for, working for God, right? A continued relationship with God. So we've got Ezra focusing on the renewing and rebuilding of the relationship, and Nehemiah focusing on the continuing of the relationship. So in other words, Nehemiah is showing us what it takes to continue that relationship with God, the determination that it takes. So kind of continuing with our introduction here, it's easy for people to say things like, this church needs to do X, or even with our country, right? This country needs to do X, or this person needs to do X. It's easy for us to say that. It's easy for us to complain, but really the question isn't whether or not I'm in charge, whether or not I'm in charge of the church or the country or whatever, but what am I going to do? What am I going to do about it? Instead of just saying that somebody else needs to do something, we need to be ready to work for God. We need to be ready to do things for God. And Nehemiah is a perfect example of this. Sometimes if God asks us to do something, that requires a sacrifice. Maybe we have to give something up. Well, we'll see that in Nehemiah, right? He gives up this prominent position as cupbearer to the king. Now, you say, well, all he did was hand the guy his wine, right? It's not a prominent position. No, a cupbearer in this time was like a trusted advisor. He had a high political position, basically, a very secure position, unless somebody tried to poison the king, of course. But anyway, he had a good position in the Persian Empire, and he gave that up to serve God, right? Sometimes whatever God's calling you to do may require special training or skills. Well, we've seen through our study in Genesis previously with Joseph, and we'll see again with Nehemiah, that God prepares you with those skills. He gives you the training, the on-the-job training that you need to serve him. In Nehemiah's position as cupbearer, he got some leadership training for the task that was ahead of him. And then sometimes projects require preparation or a plan or something done beforehand, and God provides that as well. Nehemiah's was the case for that as well. He's going to rebuild a wall, right? He's not going to put it together with Legos. He needs some workers. He needs some materials. He needs some permissions. He gets all of that, and we'll see more about that through our studying. But God paved the way for Nehemiah to perform this task that he set for him. The point that I'm making is, if God wants you to do something, you can do it. You have no excuse, right? God will provide you the means. He will provide you the way to accomplish whatever goal he sets before you if you'll just trust in him and allow him to lead in your life. So how do we get to that point? Well, as we'll learn from Nehemiah, hopefully, we got to do two main things, right? We've got to be someone who talks with God. We've got to pray consistently, continually, and have that open communion with God. And we've also got to be a person who walks with God. You've got to talk with God and walk with God. So you can't just sit around and pray, Lord, let something happen. When something starts happening, you better get going, right? You better put those prayers into action. And so I don't know about you, but I want to be a person who serves God how he wants me to. And so I'm going to try to focus on these two things, praying, and then when that prayer starts to take effect, put myself into the action, right? And that's what Nehemiah does, and hopefully we can learn from Nehemiah. So the next question is, what's God calling us to do? What's God calling you to do? A lot of people have different specific callings, but all of us have a few main callings, right? One thing that God calls us to do is, all of us, is to be leaders, like Nehemiah, right? And you say, well, I don't feel like much of a leader. Well, God's calling you to, right? God calls us to lead others to Christ. God calls us to take roles in the church and to do things like that. And so, in a way, we should all be leaders. This commentary, like I said, it's the title of it is "Be Determined." So, when I first got it, I was like, it's an interesting title. I wonder why it's "Be Determined" for Nehemiah. Well, as we'll see, Nehemiah had some great determination. But Warren Wiersbe says in there, he says, in times like today, when we have this corrupt society and sin all around us, we're still called to be Christians. We're still called to be leaders, still called to work for God. And in this time specifically, it requires a lot of determination to do that. We've got to be steadfast. We've got to be sure of where we're going and what we're doing for God. And Nehemiah, as we'll see, greatly models that determination for us. He shows us the way to serve God. Now, Nehemiah is not the only example of determination, right? Determination can be seen all around us. I'll give you a few examples from history here. Walt Disney, y'all know that guy? Familiar name to everybody? So not everybody may know the book of Nehemiah. Yeah. But everybody knows Walt Disney, famous guy, right? Did you know he was fired from a newspaper because he didn't have any ideas? He went bankrupt before he created Disney. Babe Ruth, home run king, right? He set a home run record in 1921, and in 1927 he set it again. He broke his own record. But you know he also holds the record for the most number of strikeouts? He failed a few times, didn't he? Elvis Presley, my Mama's hero, she loves him. He was fired from the Grand Ole Opry. Thomas Edison, I'm sure you know this one, it said that he needed 2,000 tries before he invented the light bulb. Something so simple as we take for granted today is a light bulb. Beethoven went deaf when he was 46, and yet he went on to compose his greatest works after he was deaf. Jonas Salk, now this may not be one that you're as familiar with, but he invented the polio vaccine. Really cool story about him if you are interested in that kind of thing. But he invented the polio vaccine, but it took him 200 attempts to get there. He had 200 failed vaccines before he got there. He said when he was asked about his 200 attempts, 200 failures, he said, well, I never failed at anything in my life. Turns out making the polio vaccine was a 200-step process. So he's an interesting fella. So all these people that we've seen, they're very famous. We've heard of all of them, if not most of them, right? And but they failed a lot, right, before they got to that point that they were able to succeed. And so what gave them that determination to keep going? What provided them that focus to strive for their goal? I tell you, I like science and all, but after 200 failed vaccines, I might say, I might be supposed to be doing something else, you know? But yeah, I'm not counting him in here because I still don't see him as a success, but he definitely had the failures. Yeah, he was rejected from basically every political career he tried to start. Yeah, yeah. Well, and he wasn't very successful in politics. Teddy Roosevelt was the same way. He tried he tried multiple times to get into politics and never succeeded until he ran in the presidency. And so a lot of people around us, we can just keep naming off examples of people who have had plenty of reason to be discouraged, and they kept going anyway. Nehemiah is one of those. So hopefully we'll look at his success through adversity here, and hopefully we'll learn more about his character. I'm not going to do a Sunday school lesson on Teddy Roosevelt or Elvis Presley. I'm not going to do a whole 6-month-long series on either of those guys, right? But we can do one on Nehemiah, because what does he have that these other guys didn't, that they were striving? Well, they were striving for something great, yes, but something worldly. Nehemiah's striving for something for God, right? And so we want to know how we can work for God, how we can have that determination to continue working for God, even when hardships and adversity get in our way. And Nehemiah's going to show us how to do that. He's going to show us how to keep going when it seems like we should give up, or we feel like we should give up. So through that, I think he's gonna teach us how to do that by answering 3 main questions. Okay, so the first and what I think is maybe arguably the most important question that we need to ask about our own goals, Nehemiah's goals, whoever, is why. Right? Why are we doing what we're doing? Why did Nehemiah want to go to Jerusalem and rebuild these walls? He's not a construction worker, right? He's a cupbearer. He's a politician type person. But he says, I'm going to go build these walls. But he had good reason for doing so. He had a good answer to this question, why. Mainly he was thinking about God and God's people and God's reputation. Without the walls, the people were unprotected from outside forces, from if these Babylonians decided to come back. There's many enemies mentioned in Nehemiah. We'll talk about them in the future here throughout our study. And they're going to attack the people. The people didn't have protection without these walls. So he's thinking about the people. He's also thinking about God and his reputation, right? The Jerusalem, it was supposed to be this beautiful city, right? This earthly representation of God's reputation, right? And what's it look like if that city's just in shambles, if it's fallen down, if there's no walls around it to make it look protected? It makes God look weak, honestly, right? And so he's thinking about God's reputation. Now, you could argue that the other way, right? Why need walls when you got such a strong God, right? But he is. That's not the way that the world around would see. And even though we're not conforming to the world, right, we want to make a good representation of God to the world. And so Nehemiah was thinking about that as well. Nehemiah's determination, I think, was fueled by zealousness for God and his people. He was ready to do whatever it took to raise God up. So we need to ask ourselves this why question. What's the reason for doing what I'm doing? What's the reason for my goal? Am I working for personal gain, or am I working for God's glory? Right? And I think that's going to be a big difference for us, right? If I'm working for personal gain, I'm working for money or fame or whatever, that can only get me so far, you know. If I'm trying something 200, 2,000 times, whatever, if I'm just doing it for me, I'm going to give up, right? But if we're doing it for something larger, if we're doing it for God, hopefully we have the determination to keep going. And so answering that why question is an important first step to developing that determination of Nehemiah. The next question I think we need to answer, we won't get far without this one, is how? How are we going to accomplish this goal? So it's all well and good to have the goal. It's all well and good to have the reason for the goal, but we need to have a way to accomplish it. Having a plan can encourage and help that determination stick with you throughout the project when things don't go quite right. One key aspect of Nehemiah's plan, though, that we need to look at and we'll see throughout is prayer. Right? Nehemiah implemented prayer into basically every aspect of his plan. I think there's like 11 prayers throughout the book of Nehemiah where he's praying for God's help or guidance. And so all the qualities and characteristics of Nehemiah that we're going to talk about that make him determined, they're all great for us to study and emulate. But I think if we're going to pick one and say, hey, we need to follow Nehemiah in this one key aspect to be determined, it's going to be prayer, right? We're not going to last long. We're not going to have that determination, and nothing's going to be as impactful for us as prayer and allowing us and our reliance on God, allowing Him to lead in our lives. And so when we're asking this question of how, when we're looking at a plan for our goal, it's not necessarily as important for us to make the plan. It's important for us to pray. That should be our plan, and God will provide us with the how. Nehemiah didn't know all the details of building a wall, so he prayed, and God provided him with the plans, the workers, the materials, and everything. And so we've got why, we've got how. The third question that we need to answer for ourselves with our goal is who, right? So hopefully the main who is you, right? If it's something that God's calling you to do, you'll be active in the process. But it's unreasonable for anyone, Nehemiah included, to expect to take on an enormous task by themselves, right? So you've got you doing this. You need God, of course. You need His help, right? And that could be all you need. But a lot of times God gives us workers as well. And we see that in the case of Nehemiah. Nehemiah goes to Jerusalem and gets workers to help him in aspects of the wall. And so sometimes we need help, and I think it's okay to ask for help, especially here at the church. You know, if we're doing a project at the church or something maybe not as physical as we might think of most projects, and maybe going and witnessing, and we're not comfortable doing that, take somebody with you, right, that is comfortable, and get you some help. If Nehemiah had tried to complete his task alone, I think he wouldn't have succeeded. You know, determination gets you a long ways, but God had a plan for Nehemiah to get help. And so he recognized that God wasn't telling him to do this by himself, and he asked for help. He got some workers to go in with him. He got the king of Persia to help him as well. And so we've got why, how, and who. Those are the questions we need to answer about our goal